I woke up early, as I always do, to the gentle sound of the wind blowing against the curtains in my bedroom. I prepare my coffee with cinnamon, a reminder of the times when I ground the beans myself in the farm kitchen. I looked in the mirror without rushing, fixed my bun, put on some subtle lipstick, and put on a simple, comfortable outfit. Nothing about me screamed luxury. I never needed it to feel whole, much less to prove something to anyone. I just wanted a pretty dress for a charity event on Saturday night. A fabric that draped well, an elegant cut, nothing extravagant, just dignified. I grabbed my worn leather bag, my old companion, and left the house with a determined step. On the way, I watched people hurrying along, each one immersed in their own world, in their own weight. Drivers honked, shop windows flashed, and I took a deep breath, crossing the streets as if crossing memories. I've walked those sidewalks so many times that I know the holes, the stalls, and the recurring faces. My driver insisted on taking me, but I preferred to walk. I like to feel the city at my own pace. There is a certain freedom in walking unnoticed, like a wind that passes and leaves no trace. I didn't need attention. I just wanted a simple, almost intimate experience between me and a dress. If there's one thing I've learned over time, it's that simplicity is sometimes the most expensive garment. The store was on a corner where the sun shines from the side, illuminating the golden sign that shines superbly. I walked in slowly, listening to the low hum of ambient music, the smell of expensive perfume mixed with new fabric. The lined-up racks resembled a muted coral, deep colors, lace, silk, crepe, precise cuts. I stepped onto the soft carpet and felt my body relax, as if the store was whispering, "Make yourself at home. Choose calmly." I had already seen a navy blue dress in the window, discreet and firm like the sea on a moonlit night. I smiled to myself, thinking that this could be my dress for that Saturday. But fate sometimes likes to talk before letting us buy what we want. I had barely taken 3 steps when a saleswoman looked me up and down with a short, cold smile. She didn't see the woman. She only saw her appearance, and that always tells only half a story. There was no kindness in the look, just a quick and impatient calculation, like someone closing the door before saying good morning. "Can I help you?" he said, already lifting his chin, as if conducting a job interview. I calmly replied that I was looking for a dress for an event, something classic and well-cut. She sighed, almost imperceptibly, as if my request were an out-of-place whim. And he pointed to a corner of the store, the most hidden, as if he were directing me to a shameful, modest section. The music suddenly seemed louder, even though it was the same. Time, in turn, slowed down. I could have left there, keeping my dignity in my pocket like a clean handkerchief. But there was a hint of curiosity, almost a spark, asking me to see how far the scene would go. Her hands hurried over hangers, pulling dresses out without really looking at me. I touched the fabrics like someone reading Braille, looking for the right story to wear that night. The navy blue of the window called to me, serene and firm, like an old friend. And it was as I turned to point it out that her voice cut through the air like a razor. "Just one detail, ma'am. We don't do installments here. It's cash only," he said, before I could ask anything. It wasn't the phrase, it was the tone. Contempt has a sound we never forget. The word detail was loaded with a judgment that pierced me like an arrow. I felt my tongue wanting to react, but first I breathed because my heart had learned not to race over any stumble. "I understand," I replied, with the serenity that age has given me. She crossed her arms, satisfied, as if she were closing a topic that hadn't even begun. And I, in silence, started another topic within myself, not accepting being diminished. The memories came without warning. My mother sewing by lamplight, stitching dreams together on cheap fabric. I learned from her that respect is a firm button. It's what keeps the piece wearable when everything else seems loose. I remembered my first salary, my first investment, the first no I swallowed to learn to wait. I was not a beginner in the field of humiliations. I had already collected a few and turned them all into steps. The saleswoman had no way of knowing that I had long strides, even when I wore worn-out shoes. She only saw the surface, and the surface is a poor advisor. Smile inside, with that smile that only we know is smiling. "Can I speak to the owner?" I asked, maintaining the tone of someone asking for a glass of water. She raised her eyebrows in surprise, as if I had asked for the safe key. "The owner is busy," he replied, without moving a muscle on his face. "I'll wait," I said, and went to the armchair near the display window, where the navy blue continued to call to me. I sat calmly, folded my hands in my lap, and let time work in my favor. Minutes can be allies when we know what we're doing there. Dignity, when seated, seems to increase in size. Through the reflection in the glass, I saw the saleswoman whispering to another employee, her eyes flashing with contempt. These little choreographies of disdain, I learned, usually have a limited audience and short applause. I breathed, counting slowly, like someone measuring a seam with a tape measure. I wanted to understand where life was going to take me before I took it back. What irony! Among so many stores on that street, I chose precisely the one that would teach me a new lesson. Sometimes the dress we need to wear is made of courage, not fabric. And in that instant, I realized I was in exactly the right place. Then a girl with a more human face came, apologizing for the delay, saying she would call the owner. I thanked him with a short nod and repeated, without rushing, that I would wait as long as necessary. There is nothing more disconcerting to impatience than the calm of someone who knows their worth. Meanwhile, I watched other customers being greeted with sugary smiles and glasses of bubbly. The selectivity of affection is a showcase that reveals the store inside. But I didn't need the sugar. I really needed it. And the truth at that moment was that I still wanted the blue dress. When the owner finally appeared, she had the rush in her eyes of someone putting out fires. A firm sweetness rose up in me, the kind that talks without shouting. "Good afternoon," I said, and the good came out in full, because I don't hold back on politeness. She responded by apologizing for her initial approach, not yet knowing what had happened. I explained it in a few words, describing the tone, not just the sentence, because tone is the fabric of intention. And I added, with the calmness of someone considering investments, I had a topic that might interest her. The saleswoman, in the background, wilted like a flower without water. I could have walked away with my pain folded up inside my bag, but I chose otherwise. There are days when life asks us to show the seams inside, stitch by stitch. I looked at the owner and said I wanted to resolve everything there in a simple and direct way. The blue dress still shone in the window, as if confirming my silent plan. I wasn't in a hurry, but I was determined, and determined is the clock that counts in our favor. I picked up my cell phone as naturally as someone picking up a cup. And it was like that, between one touch and another, that destiny began to change its clothes. The owner invited me to go to the reserved room, behind the clothes racks that hide the heart of the store. It was an elegant but small space, decorated with modern paintings and artificial flowers. I sat at a glass table while she tried to control her nervousness. Outside, the saleswoman who had scorned me was giving me distressed looks, as if she were being punished. I didn't need to look at her to feel the weight of her unease. Injustice always trembles when it is discovered. The silence in that room seemed denser than the unspoken words. And I knew that was where the twist in the story would begin. Calmly, I explained to the owner why I was there. I wanted the blue dress in the window. No extravagant luxuries, just a cut that represented me. As she spoke, I noticed that she relaxed, as if she realized that this wasn't just any complaint. But then I added in a firm tone that there was another issue that went deeper than just service. "It's not about the dress," I said. "It's about the look I got when I walked into the store." She sighed, like someone who had heard similar stories before, but hadn't expected to hear it that way. And I continued, without haste, because I knew that each word had its weight. I remembered episodes from my youth, when doors closed before me. At that time, I had no fortune, no position, not even a surname that would open paths. I only had my dreams and the stubborn will to win. I've been treated like I'm invisible so many times that I've learned to turn every slight into a stepping stone. Now, however, I wasn't willing to let it go. Not anymore. It was necessary to teach that dignity is not measured by the heel of a shoe or the price of a bag. And that was the real dress I wanted to wear that afternoon. The owner watched me carefully, perhaps not yet understanding where I was going with this. But I saw curiosity in his eyes, like someone waiting for the outcome of a romance. I picked up my worn-out bag, placed it on the table, and gently opened it. From inside, I took out my metal card, a symbol of years of silent work. I placed it on the glass with the firmness of someone who doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. The metallic sound echoed in the room like a discreet bell, announcing that something would change there. And in that moment, I realized that silence was the perfect ally of revelation. "I want to buy the whole store," he said, looking her straight in the eye. The words came out soft but firm, like a knife that cuts without hesitation. She blinked, confused, thinking he was joking. I repeated the sentence, this time more slowly, so that there would be no doubt. "I don't just want the dress, I want the store. Cash." The air seemed to stop circulating, and even the background music lost its intensity. It was as if the world held its breath to hear my decision. The owner tried to smile, still in disbelief. "Madam, I don't know if I understand," he began, but his voice wavered mid-sentence. I interrupted her with the serenity of someone who had already made up their mind. "Your lawyers can draw up the papers, but I want to sign the purchase today." Her eyes widened, perhaps assessing whether this was real or just an act. But life teaches us that some people speak to impress and others speak to deliver. And I was the second type. The silence stretched on, and I could hear hurried footsteps outside. The curious saleswoman hovered around the door, trying to understand what was happening. Little did she know that her own arrogance had paved the way for her downfall. I swallowed the urge to laugh, because fate sometimes writes with irony. Her disdain had given me the chance to turn a simple purchase into a lifelong lesson. And what was small became big before everyone. Life is skilled at giving a stage to masks that insist on falling. The owner excused herself and left for a few minutes, probably to consult someone. While I waited, I crossed my legs, straightened my coat, and looked at the window. The blue dress was still there, standing firm, as a silent witness to the scene. It was no longer just a dress, it was the symbol of a turning point that no one would forget. I smiled inwardly, remembering how many times I dreamed of this kind of moment. And I thought to myself, who would have thought the girl who sewed buttons alongside her mother now sews destinies? The emotion was great, but the face remained serene. When the owner returned, her eyes no longer held doubt, but respect. He sat down opposite me, bowed slightly, and said, "If you wish, we can begin negotiations immediately." The word lady sounded different this time, full of reverence. I nodded unhurriedly, making it clear that I wasn't rushing. Time, after all, was on my side. And there I realized that the story was just beginning. She asked why I wanted to buy that particular store. I smiled slightly, knowing my answer would be worth more than the check itself. Because the value of a store is not in the fabric it sells, but in the respect it offers. I saw the impact of the sentence in her eyes, as if she were hearing a truth that was impossible to deny. Silence enveloped us again, this time with another weight, the weight of conscience. And in that instant I knew I had made the right choice. The blue dress was waiting for me, but before that, I needed to wear my victory. The room seemed smaller when the owner brought the first documents to start the process. The air was thick with formality, but also with surprise. Never had a negotiation started in such an unusual way there. She was talking about lawyers, deeds, appraisal values, but I firmly interrupted her. I'm not asking for an appraisal, ma'am. I want to buy the store at a price the market deems fair in cash. The words fell like stones onto the glass table, strong and final. The atmosphere was no longer one of distrust, but of restrained reverence. The saleswoman who humiliated me appeared discreetly at the door, pretending to be interested in arranging hangers. I saw her in the reflection, trying to make herself small, but her anxiety was overflowing. I pretended not to notice, because silence is more educational than any scolding. It was curious to see how destiny places the right people to witness lessons that cannot be forgotten. My presence there was already the first part of the answer she needed to hear. And much more was to come. The weight of my calm was greater than the weight of her haste. As I signed some preliminary papers, I remembered my youth. I collected coins in a glass jar to buy my first party dress. The local seamstress treated me with kindness, even though she knew I could only pay in installments. There I realized that the true value is not in the fabric, but in the treatment. The world taught me early on that money buys clothes, but it doesn't buy dignity. And dignity is what gives any piece its shape. These memories made me even more certain that I was on the right path. The owner, now calmer, asked, "May I know what motivated this sudden decision?" I smiled slightly, leaning forward. I don't make sudden decisions, I just take advantage of the signs of the moment. And the sign came disguised as contempt, which turned into an opportunity. She looked down, perhaps reflecting on the team she had hired. I, in silence, let the weight of the sentence take up space. The saleswoman hurried in, pretending to bring coffee. His eyes stared at me with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I thought about all the times I was treated like I had no value. Life has shown me that every humiliation can become a long-term investment. And there was my return, in front of her, without having to raise my voice. I accepted the coffee, thanked him calmly, and looked at the documents again. The simple act of ignoring his haste was punishment enough. The store's lawyers arrived within minutes, called in quickly. They were surprised to see me there, determined and serene. They explained clauses, talked about deadlines, but I remained firm. Everything in sight, I repeated, with the calm of someone who has already made up their mind. They looked at each other, muttering technical terms, but nothing would change my purpose. The decision was already made, and a firm seam doesn't come undone in the wind. The owner nodded, realizing there was no turning back. While we waited for the adjustments, I looked at the display window again. The blue dress still called to me, silently, like a faithful witness. I smiled inside, because he had become a symbol of a greater transformation. It wasn't just about clothes, it was about destiny. A simple dress led me to buy an entire store. And the store would now be the stage for a lesson in respect. Life knows how to choose scenarios perfectly. An employee brought a leather folder with new papers. I signed each one calmly, like someone embroidering stitch by stitch. I felt the pen slide and thought, here I don't sign papers, I sign justice. With each signature, I remembered the times I was invisible. And now, in silence, I screamed without needing a voice. The weight of the pen was light, but the weight of the decision was immense. And I didn't tremble in the slightest. At the end, the owner stood up, extended her hand to me, and said, "The store is yours now." I felt the impact of the words, but I didn't celebrate like someone who wins a prize. Just smile serenely, because true victories don't need applause. I looked at the saleswoman, who was standing motionless in the doorway, her eyes filled with tears. There was no anger in me, only compassion mixed with firmness. And I thought, sometimes life teaches you in the same place where you make mistakes. The blue dress was handed to me, carefully folded. I touched the fabric and felt something beyond silk. I felt respect. It wouldn't just be clothing for an event, but a reminder of an unforgettable day. I smiled, because at that moment I wasn't buying fashion. I was buying history. and every stitch of that seam now had my name on it. Life, after all, knows how to embroider ironies masterfully. The news spread through the store faster than any sale announcement. The employees whispered among themselves, trying to confirm if it was true. I walked slowly through the corridors, now not as a customer, but as an owner. The eyes that had previously judged me in silence now looked away in respect. It was curious to see how a simple contract changes the weight of a look. That transformation was not in the clothes or the mannequins, but in the people. And every glance that crossed mine carried a silent lesson. The saleswoman who humiliated me remained behind the counter, pale. I could feel his anxiety from afar, as if he were breathing guilt. I didn't need to get closer for her to understand that I had really seen her. Because the worst punishment for those who despise is to be forced to recognize the value they denied. I stopped in front of the window, where the blue dress still reigned, untouched. I looked at him, as if contemplating a memory transformed into a symbol. And I realized that it wasn't the dress that had changed, but myself. The previous owner, now just an observer, accompanied me in silence. His hesitant steps showed that he no longer had authority there. I felt compassion, but also firmness. Her cycle was over. Everything in life has a beginning and an end, and hers was ending before me. Not with shouting, not with accusations, but with the serenity of someone who knows the right time. Life doesn't need noise to show that change has arrived. And that store was living proof of that. As I passed a large mirror, I saw my reflection. It wasn't the same woman who had walked in there hours before. My countenance now carried an aura of unquestionable authority. The raised shoulders, the confident gaze, the calm expression. Everything spoke without words. I realized that my transformation was not just internal, but visible. Even my face looked brighter, as if it had left behind decades of shadow. Dignity, after all, is the best cosmetic there is. A young employee approached, carrying an improvised bouquet of flowers from the decoration. "Congratulations, madam," he said with shyness and genuine admiration. I thanked him with a smile, accepting that simple but meaningful gesture. There was no fear in his eyes, but true respect, with no hidden interest. That was exactly the kind of energy I wanted for the future of the store. Because money buys walls and fabrics, but it is people who build the soul of a place. And that soul, I was determined to rescue. I turned my gaze to the saleswoman who, motionless, seemed to be waiting for judgment. I could have fired her right there, with a single word, but I preferred to let the silence act a little longer. The lesson needed to be felt, not just said. I thought about how many times I myself had been judged by appearances, and I understood that contempt is born more from ignorance than from malice. Still, it was time to set clear boundaries. I approached calmly, without raising my voice. "You treated me as if I were less," I said, looking into his eyes. She lowered her head, unable to bear the weight of her own actions. I continued, "Today you learned that we never know who is in front of us." The silence that followed was heavier than any scolding. I didn't need to say anything else. Sometimes silence teaches better than 1,000 speeches. I returned to the central counter, where the documents awaited my final signature. I signed calmly, taking a deep breath, as if sealing not just a deal, but a destiny. Every stroke of the pen was a reminder that I had come this far without asking permission. And now no one could erase my story. The sound of the pen scratching the paper echoed in my soul. It was the sound of quiet victory, of justice done without spectacle. And I will never forget that moment. When I stood up, the employees gave a discreet applause. It wasn't a rehearsed applause, but a spontaneous gesture of recognition. I felt my eyes well up, but I held back the tears. I didn't want to appear fragile at that moment when strength needed to speak louder. But inside, my heart danced silently. Not for revenge, but for having transformed pain into dignity. And I realized that true victory is this, when respect finally blossoms. With the blue dress in my arms, I walked to the store door. I didn't leave as a customer, but as an owner. The street looked different, brighter, as if the world had changed along with me. People passed by, oblivious to what had happened inside. Little did they know that a story of contempt and overcoming had just been written. I looked up at the sky and took a deep breath, silently giving thanks. And I thought, today I didn't just buy a store. I bought my place in respect. Back home, the blue dress lay on the living room armchair like a silent flag. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a witness to a day when dignity overcame contempt. I sat in front of him, observing the details of the stitching as if reading a memoir. Each embroidered line seemed to carry a piece of my story, sewn with sweat and patience. There, alone, I let out the tears I had been holding back in the store. They were not tears of pain, but of liberation. I cried because I had finally shown the world the strength that had always been hidden within me. As I wiped my face, I remembered the girl I was, dreamy and invisible. In those days, there was no fortune, only faith and courage. I remembered entire nights when my mother and I would mend clothes for neighbors. She said, "Daughter, every stitch you make is a lesson in patience." And how right he was. Life sewed this patience into me like an invisible cloak. It was this calm that sustained me in the face of the saleswoman's arrogance. And it was that same calm that gave me the authority to buy the store. I picked up an old photo album and opened it on the table. The black and white images showed a simple woman with steady eyes and calloused hands. It was me, decades ago, holding an old suitcase and a huge dream. I looked at that photo and thought, if only she knew how far she would go. That young woman could never have imagined that one day she would sign the purchase of a boutique. I smiled tenderly to myself, as if comforting a daughter, and I felt proud that I didn't give up on the darkest days. The phone rang, interrupting my memories. He was an old friend, curious about the rumors that were already circulating around town. "Is it true that you bought an entire store because of one dress?" he asked, laughing. I simply replied, "I bought respect, my dear. The dress was just an excuse." On the other end of the line, he fell silent, absorbing my words. Because not everyone understands that there are gestures that speak volumes beyond money. And that was the real essence of what had happened. After hanging up, I walked over to the mirror and stared at my own reflection. I didn't just see wrinkles. I saw marks of silent battles. Every line on my face told a story that no one could erase. Youth may lose its freshness, but dignity ages like rare wine. And in that reflection, I saw not just a woman, but a legacy. The respect I earned was an inheritance no one could steal, and that was worth more than any fortune. I spent the rest of the afternoon in silence, savoring the weight of achievement. There was no music, no party, just the sound of my heart at peace. I realized that true victory doesn't require an audience. It is lived in silence, within the soul, where no one can corrupt it. As the sun set, I felt something in me close down. A cycle ended, a wound healed, and that peace was priceless. In the evening, I made a cup of tea and looked at the dress again. I touched the fabric as if caressing a secret. It would be used only once, but remembered forever. Because it wasn't the elegant cut that moved me, but what it represented. The blue dress had become a symbol of my inner freedom, a reminder that we should never settle for less than we deserve, and that respect is the noblest garment anyone can wear. As I drank the tea, I thought about the saleswoman. Had she understood the lesson? Had her contempt turned to regret? I didn't wish him harm, just that he had learned. After all, we have all made mistakes when judging others. But some mistakes come at a high price, and she saw that firsthand. I hoped, from the bottom of my heart, that it would transform her. I closed my eyes and silently thanked him, not just for the victory, but for the journey that brought me there. Every humiliation, every no, Every closed door was part of the path. Without them, maybe I wouldn't have learned to be so firm. Life teaches us to transform stones into steps, and I climbed them all until I reached that moment of peace. I felt that my story was still far from over. Before going to sleep, I left the dress on the chair in front of the bed. He seemed to be watching over me, like the guardian of a new chapter. I fell asleep with a serene smile, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Because life doesn't stop, and each achievement makes room for a greater one. But inside me, something had already changed forever. I wasn't just a store owner, I was the owner of my own narrative. And no one could take that away from me. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight streamed in through the thin curtain and illuminated the blue dress still draped over the chair. It seemed to be calling to me, as if it were a silent reminder of the previous day's decision. I got up slowly, like someone who carries within themselves the responsibility of a new destiny. I prepared my coffee in silence, listening only to the sound of the liquid falling into the cup. It was curious to realize how even the simplest sound seemed loaded with meaning. That day would be like no other. While I was drinking coffee, I thought about my youth. I remembered the times when I worked in family homes, cleaning, cooking, serving. She was often treated as invisible, as if she were just another object in the house. But it was in those moments that I learned to observe in silence. I learned how the powerful behaved, how they negotiated, how they maintained their position. Every detail I absorbed was a lesson that, years later, would blossom within me. And today, finally, I reaped the fruits of that patience. I took out my old notebook, kept at the bottom of a drawer. There were phrases I wrote to keep me going on difficult days. Those who know how to wait conquer. Respect is not asked for, it is imposed with attitude. Every humiliation is a seed of victory. I read those words with teary eyes, realizing how they had come true. It was as if the woman I was had predicted the woman I am. I decided to leave the house and walk through the streets. I wanted to feel the weight of the city now that it had a new identity. People looked at me the same way as always, but I knew I wasn't the same anymore. It was strange, and at the same time liberating to realize that the greatest transformation happens within. The world outside seemed ordinary, but inside me everything had changed. I had the feeling that I had climbed an invisible step, and there was no turning back. I passed an old bakery where I used to buy bread on credit. The owner greeted me with a big smile, not knowing what I had done the day before. I smiled back, feeling a deep tenderness for that time of scarcity. It was there that I often left feeling ashamed of not being able to pay. But today, passing in front of that door, there was no more shame. There was gratitude because, without those days, I wouldn't have learned to be resilient. The invisible marks are the ones that shape our true strength. I continued walking to the city's main square. I sat on a wooden bench and watched the movement. Children played, young people laughed, old people talked as if time were eternal. There I realized that everyone carries their own silent battles. No one can imagine the weight that the other person carries in their soul, just as no one imagined the weight I had carried for so many years. And now, finally, I was free. A lady came over and asked if she could sit next to me. I nodded with a smile, and we soon began to talk. She said she had lost her job and didn't know how to start over. As he spoke, I saw in his eyes the same anguish that had once existed in mine. I gently took her hand and said, "Never underestimate the power of silence and patience." She looked at me in surprise, as if receiving unexpected advice. And in that moment, I felt that my victory was not just mine. I got up and made my way back home. As I walked, I realized that life always gives us opportunities to teach by example. My story, which was born from a gesture of contempt, now inspired even strangers. And that was the most beautiful part of victory, sharing. I didn't want my triumph to be just a personal achievement. He needed to serve as a beacon for others. Because there is no point in winning alone. When I got home, I looked at the blue dress again. He was there, standing firm, as the guardian of all my memories. I decided that I would use it not only at the event for which it had been purchased. It would also be used as a symbol in new encounters, new stories. A reminder to myself and others that life can turn around in an instant. I smiled because now I understood. I hadn't just bought a store. I had bought the right to never be underestimated again. I went to bed that night with a light heart. I closed my eyes and felt every painful memory transform into strength. There was no more room for resentment, only for learning. The saleswoman's contempt hadn't hurt me, it had just opened doors. And every door that opens deserves to be walked through with courage. That night, I fell asleep with my soul at peace, knowing that there were still many chapters ahead. 2 days later, I decided to return to the store that now bore my name. As I walked through the door, the air felt different, as if the walls had absorbed my presence. The employees were lined up, waiting, and I noticed anxious looks. Some smiled discreetly, others looked away, perhaps embarrassed by how they had treated me before. The initial silence was broken by a timid "good morning," which echoed like a new beginning. I replied firmly, but also gently. After all, leading isn't about scaring, it's about inspiring. I walked slowly through the corridors, observing every detail. The clothes seemed more vibrant, as if they proudly displayed their new destiny. I touched some fabrics, remembering that each piece there carried invisible stories. Stories of those who sewed, those who transported, those who would sell. Luxury isn't just about the price, but the journey each garment has taken. And now I wanted to transform that space into something bigger than fashion. I wanted it to be a place where every person was treated with dignity. The saleswoman who humiliated me appeared in the background, her head down. Her teary eyes did not hide her regret. I approached slowly, without haste, letting the weight of the silence reach her first. She was breathing quickly, as if she were awaiting a sentence. I looked into his eyes and saw fear, but also a seed of learning. It was not time for revenge, it was time to teach. And life had given me the opportunity to teach not with words, but with example. "Good morning," he said firmly, without taking his eyes off her. She mumbled a barely audible "good morning," like a child fearing punishment. I remained calm and added, "In here, no one will be judged by what they wear, only by the respect they offer." These words hung in the air like an order and advice at the same time. She nodded, embarrassed, unable to answer. And I felt that moment was worth more than any signature. It was justice being served with delicacy. I went to the meeting room, where the managers were waiting for me. I sat at the head of the table, and everyone settled down in silence. I explained that the store needed a new philosophy. Fashion fades, but respect remains, I declared, looking each of them in the eye. I want every customer, rich or simple, to leave here feeling valued. If we fail to achieve this, we fail, even if we sell gold. And I could see in their faces that the message had been understood. One of the young employees, the same one who had given me flowers, raised his hand. "Ma'am, can we create a special service area so that no one feels ignored?" I smiled proudly and replied, "That's exactly the spirit I want to see in here." He blushed, but the sparkle in his eyes showed genuine enthusiasm. There I realized that change was already beginning to emerge in small initiatives. It wasn't just about a store, it was about transforming a culture. And I was ready to sow this transformation with my own hands. As we spoke, the store phone rang. He was a supplier, surprised by the news of the change of ownership. I asked them to put the call on speakerphone. On the other end, I heard, "They say you bought the store outright. Is that true?" I replied calmly, "It's true. And from now on, I also buy respect." His silence lasted a few seconds before he congratulated me. I noticed that even outside the store the news was already echoing as an example. At the end of the meeting, I asked everyone to stand. This won't just be a boutique. It will be a place where stories change. I want every customer who comes in here to feel like they've found more than just clothes. May you find a shred of dignity reflected in the eyes of those who serve you. Because what clothes the body is important, but what clothes the soul is eternal. And I let those words remain as the final stitch of that meeting. They applauded, discreetly but with conviction. I left the room with a calm heart. The store was now a mirror of my own trajectory, a space that had been born of contempt but would blossom into respect. I looked back at the saleswoman, who remained motionless at the counter. I gave him a slight nod, not of superiority, but of opportunity, because everyone deserves the chance to rebuild themselves. And in that moment I realized my mission had just begun. When I returned home, I carried a new feeling inside me. It wasn't just victory, it was responsibility. Fate had given me a store, but it had also entrusted me with people. And I needed to be a guardian, not just an owner. The blue dress, once again, was waiting for me on the chair. I looked at him and thought, you open doors, now I need to keep them open. And I fell asleep with my soul at peace, ready for the next challenge. The next morning I woke up with a restless heart. The store was in good hands, but something inside me called for reflection. It was as if voices from the past were calling me to remember where I came from. I prepared my coffee slowly, in silence, listening only to the crackling of the fire on the stove. I sat at the table and closed my eyes, allowing the memories to wash over me. And suddenly, I heard my mother's voice clearly. Daughter, never let anyone treat you as less than you are. The memory of her came so strongly that my eyes welled up with tears. I remembered his tired face, but illuminated by the strength of hope. She never had riches, but she left me her greatest treasure, dignity. It was she who taught me that silence speaks louder than shouting. That honest work builds roots deeper than any appearance. And that, one day, the world would recognize who I am. In that moment, I felt I was honoring his memory. I got up and walked around the house, touching old objects. The old sewing machine was still there, silent, but full of stories. I ran my hand over the cold metal and felt as if my mother were there. How many nights we stayed side by side, sewing until our fingers bled. She smiled even with her calloused hands, saying that the pain passes, but the character remains. And it was this character that sustained me when I was judged in the store. I realized that I didn't just buy a business, I bought a link to my past. As I was reflecting, I heard a knock on the door. It was an old neighbor bringing news from the neighborhood where I grew up. We sat together, and she began to tell us how things had changed there. He spoke of families that prospered and others that lost their way. As I listened, I remembered so many faces that crossed my path. Some helped me, some hurt me, but all were teachers. Life always teaches us, even in the most painful chapters. The neighbor then commented, "Everyone is talking about you, you know?" I smiled in surprise and replied, "What do they say?" Who showed the world that humility is not weakness, it is strength in disguise. These words touched my heart more than any compliment, because deep down that was exactly what I wanted to show. I didn't buy the store to prove wealth, but to prove value. And seeing that people understood this was my greatest gift. After she left, I was alone again. I took out an old letter kept in a wooden box. It was from my father, who left us early, but before he wrote, "My daughter, do not fear the world. It always respects those who do not bow down." I read those lines with trembling hands, feeling the echo of the blood in my veins. Maybe he wasn't physically present, but his words always lived in me. And in that moment, I realized I was not alone in my victory. I thought again about the store and what it represented. It wasn't just a sales space, but an altar to my memories. Each shelf would be a reminder of who I was and who I have become. Every customer who walked in there would, without knowing it, carry a piece of my story. And I wanted everyone to feel the same dignity I fought to achieve. The store would be more than just a business, it would be a testimony. A place where past and present intertwine. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to write in my diary. Today I understood that my victory did not begin with the signing of the contract. It started way back, in my mother's calloused hands, in my father's letters, in the silent tears of so many sleepless nights. Everything was stitched together until the moment I could get up. Contempt was just the final thread that closed the seam. Now, I continue sewing the future with a needle of courage. I closed the diary and stared at the blue dress once more. It was there, motionless, but it seemed to pulse like a living heart. It was as if every thread of the fabric carried the voice of my family, a quiet whisper that said, "You did it." I touched the fabric with reverence, as if touching a sacred relic. I smiled with tears in my eyes and silently thanked him, because, more than anything, I knew the victory was not mine alone. Before going to sleep, I sat in front of the window and gazed at the stars. The sky seemed open, vast, full of promise. I closed my eyes and felt my ancestors smiling from above. And I thought, "You never left me. You were always with me." I fell asleep with this certainty, light as a child in its mother's arms. And for the first time in many years, I slept without any weight on my heart. Tomorrow, I knew, new challenges awaited me. The big charity event was finally approaching, and the blue dress was waiting for its moment. I spent the morning in silence, preparing myself not only externally, but also internally. I knew that night wouldn't just be a party, but a symbolic stage. There would be gathered the same faces that for years looked down on me. People who thought they were bigger because they wore designer brands and had old surnames. But this time I would arrive not as the woman being judged, but as the store owner. And that difference would be felt in the air, even if no one said a word. As I was getting ready in front of the mirror, I noticed something curious. It wasn't the dress that made me look great, it was my posture. The blue fabric only highlighted what already shone in me: dignity. I remembered the saleswoman, the humiliation, and how it had all turned into victory. I smiled when I thought that life has a way of giving us back double what they take from us. The reflection in the mirror showed me not an aging lady, but a warrior. And in that instant I knew I was ready for the night. I arrived at the hall with firm steps. The lights reflected off the crystals, and soft music lulled elegant conversations. Some looked at me in surprise, others feigned indifference. But in all their looks I noticed the same silent question. What happened to her? There was something different, a glow that didn't come from jewelry or makeup. It was the light of someone who won without having to shout. A familiar lady, always haughty and mocking, approached with her false smile. "What a beautiful dress, dear. It looks like it came straight out of your store window," she said sarcastically. I looked calmly and replied, "Yes, it did. And from my window. After all, the store is mine now." Her smile froze for a second, like a glass shattering on the floor. I noticed whispers spreading around, like fire running through dry straw. There was no ostentation there, just a truth spoken calmly. And it was this calm that made everyone pay attention. During dinner, conversations revolved around business and appearances. But for me, every word spoken seemed empty compared to what I felt. Because in that room, surrounded by powerful people, I no longer needed to prove anything. I was there not as a tolerated guest, but as an undeniable presence. And that was worth more than any applause. My heart beat rhythmically, like an internal song of victory. That night would be remembered not for its luxury, but for its meaning. A businessman raised his glass and proposed a toast to the new phase of our society, marked by courage and transformations. Some looked in my direction, and I realized my gesture resonated beyond me. It wasn't just about a purchase, it was about the courage to not accept contempt. Dignity, when reaffirmed, spreads like a flame that warms others. and I felt like I was inspiring even those who would never admit it out loud. That was the real victory, being an example without having to give a speech. After the toast, I walked to the balcony of the hall. The cool night air enveloped me, bringing relief and peace. I looked up at the sky and silently thanked it for being there, strong, whole. The stars shone like silent witnesses to my journey, and I realized that every tear in the past had prepared me for that moment. Nothing had been in vain, neither the pain nor the humiliation. It was all part of the perfect seam of life. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. It was a young waiter who hesitated before speaking. "Madam, forgive my boldness, but I wanted to say that your story is already circulating in the halls. You are an inspiration to many here, even among us who serve." He showed that respect is the greatest wealth anyone can achieve. I looked at him tenderly and simply replied, "Never forget that, my son." And I saw in his eyes the flame that starts when someone believes in themselves. I went back to the ballroom and danced to a single song. I didn't need important peers or approving glances. I danced with myself, in peace, with the lightness of someone who finally belongs. The blue dress followed every movement, as if it had a life of its own. It was as if he too was celebrating, grateful for having been an instrument of justice. When the song ended, I received discreet applause from some corners of the room. But the greatest applause came from within, the silence of my heart at peace. That night, when I returned home, I left the dress folded carefully. He had fulfilled his mission, transforming a party into a milestone in my life. I sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath, feeling lighter than ever. I realized that true elegance is not in what we wear, but in what we convey, and that no contempt can extinguish the light of those who know their own worth. I fell asleep with this certainty, ready to write new chapters, because I knew my story still had a lot to reveal. The day after the dance, I woke up to the phone ringing nonstop. There were invitations for interviews, requests for meetings, curious people wanting to know details. The news that I had bought the store outright had spread like wildfire. Some called me to congratulate me, others out of pure curiosity. And there were also those who, in a disguised tone, tried to find out if it was true. I smiled silently, because I already knew, when the truth bothers me, it always spreads quickly. And now, no one could deny who I was anymore. While answering the calls, I noticed something curious. The same people who had previously ignored me now treated me with exaggerated courtesy. They called me respectable lady, reference, example. But deep down, I knew that many were just hiding the discomfort of my rise. It's curious how respect changes its name when it's born from surprise. But to me, their intentions didn't matter much. The essential thing was that my dignity was finally protected. In the afternoon, I went to the store once more. There was more movement than normal, customers coming and going nonstop. Some came just to see the new owner, as if she were a circus attraction. Others took the opportunity to buy, curious about the renewed energy. I watched everything in silence, without needing to impose myself. Because when change is real, it speaks for itself. And that afternoon, the store spoke loudly. A journalist appeared asking for an interview. I looked at him firmly and replied, "I didn't buy it to show off, I bought it to change." He insisted, saying that the public wanted to know my version. I took a deep breath and said, "Then write that this store now belongs to respect." He smiled awkwardly, realizing he wouldn't be able to get any lines out of the show. My victory didn't need flashy headlines. It just needed to be lived authentically. As I walked through the aisles, I met the saleswoman again. This time, she approached with tears in her eyes. "I want to apologize. I was arrogant, unfair, blind." I looked into his eyes and saw sincerity, not just fear. I put my hand on his shoulder and replied, "Mistakes happen. What matters is what we do after them." She wept silently, and in that moment, I felt I had planted a new seed. In the evening, I received an unexpected visit from a lawyer. He brought papers about the officialization of the purchase and about future contracts. As I signed, I realized these weren't just documents. They were pages where my story was rewritten with the ink of justice. Each signature was a reminder that we must never shrink from contempt, because life always offers the chance to turn the page with dignity. And I had decided to turn mine around in style. In the following days, the news took on other forms. Some said I was a hidden millionaire, others that I had received a mysterious inheritance. Few knew the truth. My heritage was not made of numbers, but of resilience. And that was something no newspaper could put into words. True wealth is invisible, and only those who cultivate it know how to recognize it. I smiled when I saw so many versions running around the city, because the truth, silent, remained intact within me. An old acquaintance met me on the street and said, "You are proof that no one should be underestimated." These words echoed in my mind all day. It was as if my story finally served as a living lesson, not just for those who have despised me, but for those who have also been despised. I knew that every curious look now secretly carried a spark of reflection, and that was worth more than any public recognition. Back home, I sat down in front of the diary. I wrote, "Today I realized that my victory is not just mine. It belongs to everyone who has ever been judged by their appearance, ignored by their arrogance. She is a testament to the fact that life does not bow to contempt. She stands patiently until quiet justice is done." I closed the diary with a serene smile, and I felt that page was sewn forever into my story. That night, before I went to sleep, I stared at the blue dress again. It seemed to glow in the soft light of the lampshade, as if it were more than fabric. It was a symbol, it was a flag, it was a witness. I lay down with a light heart, knowing that the world could no longer erase me, because now I was a living reminder that respect cannot be bought with money, but with the courage to remain standing even when they want to bring us to our knees. And with that certainty, I fell asleep ready for what was yet to come. The following days were filled with a strange sense of calm. I no longer needed to chase anything, and yet everything seemed to come to me. It was as if life had opened a silent portal where dignity attracted opportunities. But in the midst of so much movement, I began to reflect on something even bigger. What would I leave behind, besides walls, clothes, and contracts? Because inheritance is not only made up of goods, but also of examples. And I knew the greatest wealth I possessed was invisible. That Sunday, I sat down to write a letter. It wasn't for lawyers, nor for business. It was for my grandchildren, those who did not yet understand the weight of a life. My dears, life does not measure you by what you wear, but by what you carry in your heart. Each word was stitched together with the same patience I learned from my mother. I wanted them to know that the greatest jewel they can wear is respect, and that the world always bows before those who know who they are. As I wrote, memories of when I was young came to mind. I remembered the days when people looked at me as invisible on the streets of the rich neighborhood. I remembered the times I served coffee in houses that weren't mine, and how I promised myself that one day I wouldn't be defined by what was missing. It was strange to think that all of that now seemed so far away. But in truth, each humiliation still lived inside me like a scar. Scars no longer hurt, but they never stopped teaching. I decided to visit the cemetery where my parents were laid to rest. I took simple flowers, but chosen with care. As I knelt before the tombstone, I felt a lump in my throat. "You always said respect would come, and you were right," I muttered. I closed my eyes and felt a deep peace, as if they heard me. The light wind that passed through the trees seemed like a silent answer. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't living just for myself. On the way back, I crossed paths with a humble woman who recognized me. She stopped, adjusted her worn purse, and said, "Thank you for showing me it's possible." His eyes shone like someone who finds strength in the example of others. I smiled and squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his sincere gratitude. I realized that the scope of my victory went beyond the store windows. She was like an invisible current that touched silent hearts. And that, yes, was wealth that no amount of money could buy. When I got home, I found my grandchildren playing in the living room. They ran up to me laughing, asking for old stories. I sat on the couch and started telling him not about the store, but about my mother. I spoke of the strength she had even when the world seemed to be falling apart. I explained that courage is not shouting, but remaining firm in silence. They listened attentively, like someone who knows they are receiving something valuable. And I realized that I was passing on to them the invisible inheritance. Later, looking out the window, I reflected on the weight of responsibility. Having money is easy, having attitude is difficult. Anyone can spend, but few know how to honor. And that's what I decided to teach, that every choice carries a legacy. That every act of dignity builds a bridge that others can cross. And that, in the end, we will only be remembered for the respect we cultivate. This was the testament I had already begun to write while I was still alive. Then I received an unexpected visit, the young employee who had given me flowers. He had a notebook in his hands, shyly, and said, "Ma'am, I wrote down the phrases you say. They help me to have courage." I picked up the notebook with emotion, seeing my own words reflected there. It was as if my life was already being translated into teachings, and I realized that maybe my destiny was greater than I imagined. Perhaps I was born not only to live, but to inspire. That night I wrote in my diary, "Inheritance is not what we leave in the bank, but what we leave in the hearts of others." Today I realize that my story is no longer just mine. She belongs to every look that found hope in seeing me standing. And that's enough for me, because I know that even when I'm gone, I'll still be alive. Live in the respect, courage, and dignity that I planted. This is the invisible inheritance that no one can steal. I closed the diary, took a deep breath, and looked at the blue dress once more. He seemed to smile silently, complicit in every step of my journey. It wasn't just clothing, it was a witness to a transformed destiny. I felt a deep serenity, like someone who no longer owes anything to the past. I went to bed knowing that I had accomplished yet another mission, because victory is only complete when it becomes a legacy. And I was already starting to write mine. That morning, I decided to walk to the city's central square. I wanted to feel again the ground that I so often walked on in silence, ignored by many. Now, I returned with my head held high, but without ostentation, only with the serenity of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. As I watched the ancient trees and the children running around, I heard someone calling me. I turned around and saw a figure I hadn't seen in decades, my old childhood friend. She approached slowly, her eyes filled with surprise. "I can't believe it. Is that really you?" he said, holding my hands. I smiled and replied, "It's me, still the same, just with more wrinkles and stories." She laughed through her tears, remembering the times we dreamed together. At that moment, I remembered the afternoons when we shared stale bread and hope, how we talked about a future where we would be respected, and how life had taken us down such different paths. It was a reunion that touched me more than any recent compliment. We sat on a bench in the square and started talking. She told me about the struggles she had, about the closed doors. He spoke of how he had often been invisible, just as I had been, and how she almost lost faith in herself. When he saw me on television giving an interview, he thought I wasn't the same person. But now, face to face, she said, "You are proof that the impossible is only delay." That sentence went deep into my heart. As she spoke, I realized she carried the same flame in her eyes as I did, a flame that does not go out, even after so much rain. I told her that every tear is just water watering seeds of courage. And no matter how hard life is, it never ceases to surprise. My friend squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up. You gave me back my faith." And I realized that this meeting was not a coincidence, it was destiny. Some people around started watching us, not out of curiosity, but because I realized the strength of two women who survived. It was as if the simple act of talking was, in itself, a lesson. Dignity, after all, doesn't need a stage. It shines even on park benches. We talk about children, losses, small and invisible victories. And we discovered that despite our differences, we still share the same values: respect, courage, and faith in what life has in store. As I said goodbye to her, I felt a lump in my throat. We promised to meet again, but I knew there might not be a next time. Time has taught us not to trust too much in tomorrow. So I hugged her tightly, as if sealing a covenant of gratitude. I returned home, reflecting on what this reunion meant. It was as if life had shown me my own reflection in the mirror of destiny. And that reflection said, "You didn't win alone. You won for all of us." Arriving home, I found my grandchildren playing in the garden. One of them ran up to me and asked, "Grandma, why do people want to talk to you so much now?" I smiled and replied, "Because now they hear what has always been there." I placed my hand on my chest, showing that strength always comes from within. They laughed and went back to playing, not understanding the depth of the answer. But I knew that one day they would remember that phrase. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy I could leave. Later, writing in my diary, I recorded, "Today I realized that personal victories are never just ours. They become beacons for those who still walk in the dark." And every reunion that life brings is proof of this. Nothing is a coincidence. Everything is an invisible seam that guides us. Whether it's a park bench or a grand hall, dignity shines with the same brilliance. And that glow cannot be extinguished. I closed the diary and stared at the blue dress again. He seemed to look back at me, as if he understood each new lesson. He was not only a witness to my achievement, but also to my mission. I realized that he no longer represented just overcoming contempt. Now, it was also a symbol of hope for others, a silent reminder that everyone can rise up, even when disbelieved. And with that certainty, I fell asleep in peace. That night, I dreamed of my mother and my childhood friend together. They smiled at me, as if blessing the path I had taken. I felt that life was leading me to something even greater. Something that went beyond the store, beyond the dress, beyond myself. I woke up with a light heart and moist eyes, as if I had received a message. Perhaps destiny still had unexpected chapters in store, and I was ready to live them with courage and serenity. That week, walking the streets became different. Where there had previously been looks of disdain, now respectful greetings appeared. Some called me by name, others just waved silently. There was a mixture of curiosity and admiration in the air. It was as if my story had become common talk in bakeries and markets. And I, who had so often been invisible, was now a noticeable presence. The contrast was so great that at times it felt like a dream. One day, while I was buying flowers, I heard two ladies whispering. "They say he bought the store outright, can you imagine?" The other replied, "And to think that the saleswoman treated her badly. The world goes round." I smiled discreetly, without intruding. There was no need to confirm anything. The truth already spoke of itself. It was curious how people feed on stories that inspire, and mine had become a kind of living legend. However, it wasn't just light comments that were emerging. Some said I must have made hidden deals. Others hinted at mysterious inheritances or secret plots. I smiled at these inventions because I knew they were a reflection of disbelief. People always try to explain what they don't understand, and when they can't, they create fantasies to fill the void. But the truth, simple and serene, did not need to be defended. One afternoon, as I was leaving the store, I was approached by a young student. He asked me for a few minutes to talk. "Madam, I'm writing a paper about overcoming, and I discovered that his story is told all over the city. I would like to cite her as an example of dignity." I looked at him emotionally and accepted. He said, "Write that dignity is not a gift, it is a daily achievement." I realized at that moment that my trajectory went beyond the limits of commerce. She had already become a kind of living classroom, not only for young people seeking inspiration, but also for older people. Many saw in me the chance to believe that it is never too late to win. And this responsibility filled me with humility, because I knew I wasn't just speaking for myself, but for everyone who carried scars. And every word needed to be carefully measured. On a visit to the market, a man stopped me with tears in his eyes. I was humiliated so many times that I thought about giving up, but seeing you gave me the strength to carry on. I hugged him without saying much, because sometimes silence speaks louder than speeches. I understood that each gesture of mine was no longer just mine, but had an impact on others, and that my victory had become a collective hope. It was like carrying an invisible cloak of responsibility. At night, alone at home, I reflected on the weight of this. Being seen as an example is beautiful, but it also requires constant firmness. I could not allow petty vanities to tarnish my achievement. My life was now being watched, and every choice was a lesson. This reminded me of my mother's words. "When you lift your head, many lean on your shoulder." And I felt exactly that now. The blue dress, hanging on the hanger, seemed to be watching my thoughts. It was no longer just a souvenir of the purchase, but a public symbol. People associated my image with him, as if it were armor of respect. I smiled at the thought that a simple fabric could carry so much meaning. It was more than fashion, it was a message. And maybe that was the true power of simple things. Becoming a symbol when least expected. I wrote in my diary before going to sleep. Today I heard the voices of the city echoing my name. Some carry admiration, others distrust. But they all prove that I'm no longer invisible. I am part of a story bigger than myself. And this story continues to be written with each meeting. I closed the journal feeling grateful, but also vigilant. As I turned off the light, I thought about how life takes silent turns. Those who were once the object of contempt now become voices remembered on every corner. And I realized that this wasn't just a victory, it was a responsibility. Fate called me to remain firm, without losing my humility. Because true greatness is not in being talked about, but in continuing to be an example. I fell asleep with that certainty, ready for the next chapter. And I knew there were still lessons that life had in store for me. The next morning I woke up with a feeling of strange tranquility. The city continued talking about me, but inside the house there was silence. And it was in that silence that I began to realize its true value. In the past, silence oppressed me, making the voices of contempt echo within me. Now, it had become an ally, a shelter, a space for reflection. I sat in the armchair by the window and just watched the world go by. It was there that I understood the difference between noise and truth. As the phone rang nonstop, I let it sit there. It's not always necessary to respond to everyone. Sometimes you just need to listen to your own heart. The silence told me that I had won, but that I could not rest yet. Because the greatest victory is not in conquering, but in sustaining what has been conquered. And that requires balance, firmness, and humility. I remembered my mother's words, "Daughter, those who climb quickly must learn to descend slowly." I smiled as I remembered how she always knew how to say so much with so little. In the afternoon, I received a visit from the former saleswoman. She entered shyly, carrying a bouquet of simple flowers. "I want to thank you for the second chance," he said, his voice breaking. I calmly replied, "The real apology is change." She lowered her head and promised not to repeat her mistakes. I felt that, at that moment, the silence between us spoke louder than any words. It was as if respect had finally found its place. After she left, I walked to the store. I noticed that customers were already talking about the new environment. "The atmosphere here has changed," commented a lady in the queue. It wasn't just about clothes, it was about the way you were treated. And this change did not come from advertising campaigns, but from attitude. I realized that respect can be silent, but it is always recognized. And that recognition was more precious than any profit. When I returned home, I found an anonymous letter on the door. In it, someone wrote, "Thank you for showing that dignity cannot be bought. It is earned." There was no signature, just a simple dash at the end. I held that letter with trembling hands, overcome with emotion. Someone, somewhere, had found strength just by watching me. This made me understand even more the weight of silence. He doesn't scream, but he transforms. That night, he didn't want company or visitors. I just sat in front of the mirror with the blue dress on my lap. I touched the fabric and felt every fiber, as if it were part of my skin. He carried within himself all the stories, pains, and achievements. Looking at him was like looking at myself, whole and victorious. It was a silence full of meaning, a silence that embraced me. And in him, I found peace. In the diary I wrote, "Silence is the voice of those who no longer need to prove anything." Today I understood that I no longer need to shout to be heard. Just exist with dignity, and the world will listen. Every simple gesture echoes more than speeches. And true respect is born when we learn to keep quiet at the right time. I closed the notebook with a serene sigh. As I got ready for bed, I remembered the days I cried alone. The silence of humiliation was heavy, suffocating, cruel. Today, that same silence had become light, full of meaning. I realized that it wasn't time that changed, it was me. And it is this internal transformation that no one can take away. I lay down gratefully, knowing that silence is now my ally. And in it I found the greatest wealth, peace. In the early morning, I woke up to the wind hitting the window. I looked outside and saw the deserted street, lit only by the moon. It was as if the whole world had stopped to listen. I closed my eyes and thought, my life has become a testimony, and I felt that there were still chapters to be lived, kept by destiny. The silence, once again, lulled me into a deep sleep, and in it, I fell asleep with my heart at peace. That morning, I received an unexpected invitation. An old acquaintance from high society invited me to tea at her house. He was someone who, in the past, would barely greet me on the street. Now his letter was adorned with kind, even affectionate words. I smiled as I read it, because I understood that it wasn't affection, but convenience. The world is quick to don masks when it perceives shifts in power, and even quicker to let them fall when they are not supported by truth. I decided to accept the invitation, not out of vanity, but out of observation. I wanted to see how far the new attitudes of those who previously despised me would go. Upon arrival, I was greeted with exaggerated hugs and forced smiles. The table was laden, as it always had been, but now there was a place of honor for me. I sat down calmly, without needing to prove anything. As they talked about business, fashion, and travel, I remained serene, because I knew that the greatest wealth I carried was invisible. During the meeting, I noticed curious looks being thrown in my direction. Veiled questions arose. How did you do it? Who helped you? What was the secret? I always answered simply, I did it because I didn't give up. That answer, although short, left an uncomfortable silence in the air. They expected to hear of secret plots or miraculous inheritances. But the truth was too simple for those who lived by appearances. And it was in this contrast that I saw, one by one, the masks begin to fall. One of the women, who had previously been arrogant towards me, approached me timidly. I must confess that I've spoken disparagingly of you in the past. I looked into his eyes and said, You don't have to confess, I already knew. She lowered her head in shame and asked for forgiveness. I could hear the sincerity in his voice, and I accepted the request calmly. Because forgiveness frees the one who offers it more than the one who receives it. And I no longer carried grudges, only lessons. Upon returning home, I reflected on what I had witnessed. Society is quick to build castles of vanity, but they crumble before the simplicity of the truth. Those who live by appearances always fear the gaze of others, while those who live with dignity carry with them unshakable freedom. And that was the difference I could now see clearly. Masks, sooner or later, always fall. In the store, I noticed the same transformation happening. Customers who previously treated employees with superiority were now more polite. It was as if the change in posture had spread throughout the room. Dignity was not imposed by rules, but inspired by example. And I realized that, just as masks fall, new values can emerge. The store stopped being just a business and became a space of respect. And that gave me a quiet pride. Later, I received a call from my childhood friend. She laughed and said, "I hear that now even the fakes want to be by your side." I replied, "It doesn't matter who is by my side. What matters is who truly walks with me." There was a brief silence, and then she added, "That's why you won." I smiled when I heard that because I knew it was true. Victory is never made of false applause, but of firm convictions. And that was the invisible inheritance I cultivated every day. When writing in my journal, I recorded, "Today I saw masks falling before the simplicity of truth." I didn't need to shout or prove anything. It was enough to exist with dignity for the false to be revealed. I understood that it is not necessary to fight lies. It is enough to remain in the truth, because it, by itself, illuminates what was hidden. I closed the notebook with the serenity of someone who had learned another lesson. Before going to sleep, I looked at the blue dress again. It seemed to reflect not only my story, but also the fall of illusions. It was as if to say, "See how everything reveals itself in its own time." I went to bed with that certainty in my heart. The world may try to hide the truth behind masks, but nothing can resist the silent force of dignity. And with that thought, I fell asleep peacefully. On Sunday morning, I decided to walk to the old church in the neighborhood. Not out of religiosity, but out of nostalgia. There, when I was young, I would sit on the last benches to rest from work. It was my silent refuge, a space where I could dream without interruption. As I walked in, I smelled the familiar scent of wood and burning candles. Time seemed to have stood still inside that temple. And it was in this scenario that I found some unexpected advice. An elderly gentleman whom I didn't know approached slowly. With a worn hat and short steps, he sat down beside me. "Can I speak to you, ma'am?" he asked softly. I nodded, curious about what he had to say. He looked at the empty altar and began. "I heard your story on the streets, and I want to tell you something. Don't let vanity steal what you have achieved." His words pierced me like arrows. They were not said in an accusatory tone, but in a caring tone. I explained that my victory was not born of vanity, but of pain. He smiled and replied, "That's where the danger lies. The greatest temptations appear after victory, not before it." I remained silent, reflecting on that. It was a reminder that dignity requires constant vigilance. As we talked, he told his own story. He said he had owned land, but lost everything by trusting the wrong people. Pride blinded me, and when I realized it, it was too late. He spoke with discreet tears in his eyes, but without rancor. I learned that the most valuable asset is not land, nor money. It is the ability to keep a clear conscience. And he concluded, "You have this, ma'am. Don't miss it." I left the church with a heavy but grateful heart. That stranger had reminded me of what I already knew, but needed to hear. Vanity is like a shadow. It appears when the light grows. And if we are not careful, it slowly swallows us. I decided I wouldn't let it get to me. My victory would not be a stage for arrogance, but for example. And that's how I wanted to be remembered. In the afternoon, I sat down with my grandchildren to play in the yard. They ran with the innocence of those who don't yet know the weight of the world. As I laughed with them, I realized the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't in the shop windows, nor in the headlines, nor in the whispers of the city. It was there, on the dirt floor, in the loose laughter, in the tight hugs. And I understood that no power is greater than this. To be loved by someone who doesn't judge me for what I have. Later, I wrote in my diary. Today I received some advice that sounded like a warning. The real enemy of dignity is not contempt, it is vanity. And it appears when we least expect it, disguised as a compliment. I need to stand firm, remembering where I came from, and teach my people that the greatest inheritance is humility. I closed the notebook with tears in my eyes, but calm. At night, in front of the mirror, I put on the blue dress again. I wanted to look at it not as a symbol of victory, but of vigilance. I touched the fabric and said in a low voice, "Don't let me forget." It was almost a prayer, not to the dress, but to the story it carried, because every fiber reminded me of the price I paid to get here, and that it would be worth nothing if I lost myself to vanity. I smiled knowingly and hung it back up. I lay down reflecting on the words of the church lord. Victory is fragile if it is not accompanied by humility. And life, generous as it is, always sends messengers to remind us of this. That night, I fell asleep grateful that I had heard the warning in time. And I promised myself that I wouldn't let the outside lights extinguish the flame within. Because dignity is not displayed, it is kept like a secret treasure. And I was willing to protect her until the end. As the weeks went by, I realized that not everyone was celebrating my victory. Amongst the looks of admiration, there were also looks of shadow. Envy manifested itself in whispers, malicious comments, and even false praise. It was as if some couldn't bear to see someone, previously invisible, gain respect. At first, these reactions hurt me, but I soon understood their true meaning. Envy is just a reflection of the other person's inability to deal with their own defeats. And I couldn't allow it to poison my heart. One episode profoundly marked this phase. As I left the store, I found an anonymous note stuck to the door. "You don't deserve what you have, it was just luck," it said in shaky letters. I held the paper for a few seconds and then tore it apart silently. Not because it bothered me, but because it didn't deserve space in my life. An envious person's words say more about him than about the target. And that was the lesson I chose to keep. Even so, I could feel the weight of these feelings in the air. Some acquaintances avoided my presence, as if my victory bothered them. Others approached just to gain advantages. It was a silent game, where everyone revealed their true face. And I, with patience, learned to distinguish who came with a sincere heart and who brought poison. Time always reveals who is really by our side. And this invisible filter was also part of my new reality. During that period, I sought silence even more. I started writing letters to myself, as if they were advice from a friend. In them, I remembered that dignity does not depend on applause, and that the value of a life is not measured by what others say, but by who you are. These letters became my refuge, my most faithful mirror. Every word was a reminder that I was not alone, even in the face of envy, because my conscience was the best company I could have. One day, a young employee came to me, worried. "Madam, I heard bad things about you in town." I touched his hand and said, "Let them talk. Those who need to speak ill of others only reveal their own weakness." She smiled with relief, as if she had received a lesson. And in that moment I realized, my every reaction was an example for those around me. The responsibility of being an inspiration required calm, even in storms. At night, I revisited old memories. I remembered the days when I was teased for wearing simple clothes. At that time, every harsh word hurt me like a knife. Today, however, I realized that those scars had prepared me. They taught me not to depend on other people's approval. And without knowing it, Those who humiliated me gave me the greatest strength, resilience. I felt a silent gratitude for everything I experienced. The blue dress remained on the hanger as the guardian of my reflections. I looked at him and thought, even envy cannot dim the brightness of truth. It was curious how a simple fabric could become a shield against so many storms. Because, deep down, the dress didn't represent wealth, but resistance. And resistance is something that no envious look can destroy. He was living proof that dignity is unshakable when it comes from within. And that made me even stronger. I wrote in my diary, "Today I learned that envy is the visible price of victory. She walks alongside respect, like a shadow of light. But there is no need to fight it, just stand firm. Because just as shadow does not exist without light, envy only arises where there is true conquest." I closed the diary with the serenity of someone who no longer fears whispers. As I lay down, I thought about the words of that gentleman from the church. The greatest temptations appear after victory. Envy, I realized, was one of them, not because it could destroy me, but because it could lead me to respond with pride or anger. I promised myself I wouldn't fall into that trap. My path was one of silent peace, not of strife. And, with that purpose, I fell asleep in peace. One calm afternoon, I decided to visit the neighborhood where I grew up. The streets were narrow, the houses simple, and every corner held a memory. There, I had cried with hunger, dreamed in silence, and learned to resist. As I walked, I saw children playing the same way I played. They laughed without knowing that, one day, life would demand courage from them. I felt a pang of nostalgia, mixed with gratitude. It was there that the roots of my strength were born. I found the old neighbor, already with silver hair and slow steps. She hugged me, as if no time had passed. "I knew you would be different," he said with emotion in his eyes. I told her a little about my achievements, without exaggeration. She just smiled and added, "It's not money that changed you, it's dignity." Those words echoed deep in my heart. That's exactly what I wanted to be remembered for. As we walked together, she showed the marks of time. These streets have seen a lot of pain, but also a lot of overcoming. We talk about neighbors who have passed away, about joys and disappointments. It was like revisiting chapters that were stored in memory. And I realized that, even though I left there, that place never left me. Every brick, every memory was part of my essence. And without these roots, no victory would have meaning. Back at my old house, I found the old tree in the backyard. Its branches were crooked but firm, as if defying time. I touched the trunk and felt the same scars as before. That's where I rested after long days of work. There I cried silent defeats that no one saw. And there I also dreamed of a future that seemed impossible. Now that dream had come true. I sat in the shade of the tree and closed my eyes. The memories came in waves, some sweet, some bitter. But all of them, without exception, were responsible for who I had become. There is no victory without the past. There is no dignity without a scar. And I understood that my roots were not shameful, but sacred. They supported my life as the tree supported its branches. As I left the neighborhood, a child ran after me. "Young lady, they said you own a nice store." I smiled and replied, "I am, but the most beautiful thing is never forgetting where we come from." Her eyes widened as if she had heard a revelation. In that moment, I realized that even a simple sentence could plant a seed. And maybe that was my mission now, to sow hope, because I knew how much a word could save someone. Back home, I looked at the blue dress. He was not just a symbol of overcoming. It was also a reminder of my roots, because without the past, there would be no present. And every victory would lose its shine if it were disconnected from its origin. The dress was, at the same time, the fruit and root of my story, and I guarded it with silent devotion. I wrote in my diary, Today I revisited my roots and realized that it is in them that my strength lies. Whoever forgets where they came from loses the sense of where they are. I don't want to be remembered just for the store, but for the road I've traveled. Because dignity is born in scarcity and flourishes in respect. And those who recognize their roots never lose ground. I closed the notebook feeling whole. That night, I fell asleep lightly, like someone who had rediscovered their own essence. The roots of the past, once heavy, now seemed like wings to me. It was as if every old tear had been turned into fuel. And I realized that the greatest triumph was not in what I achieved outside. It was in what I built within myself, with the help of time. Because life doesn't give us anything for free, but it rewards those who persist. And it was with this thought that sleep lulled me. One morning I was called to resolve a dispute in the store. A customer demanded priority service, citing social status. The employees were insecure, fearing his arrogance. I decided to intervene personally, calmly and firmly. I looked into his eyes and said, "Here, respect is the only priority." There was silence, and the woman left without a word. There I realized, the word, when supported by truth, carries more weight than any fortune. This scene quickly spread throughout the city. Some criticized my stance, others applauded. But what struck me most was the look on the employees' faces. I saw in them a relief, a renewed confidence. It wasn't just the store owner talking, it was the experience of a lifetime. And in that moment, I understood that my greatest legacy was not in my possessions, but in the silent authority that dignity grants. In the afternoon, I received a visit from a lawyer with a tempting proposal. He wanted to use my name in prestigious campaigns and deals. I politely declined, explaining, "My word is not for sale." He insisted, trying to show his advantages, but I remained firm. I had already learned that money without truth is empty, and that trust is lost with a single lie. I would rather remain silent than use my voice for falsehoods. At home, I remembered the times when no one listened to my words. I spoke and was ignored, as if I were invisible. Today, every sentence was listened to carefully, even recorded in newspapers. But for me, nothing had changed within my heart. She was still the same woman who believed in the value of simplicity. And he knew that the word is like a seed. It only blooms in fertile soil. Therefore, he took care of it as if it were his most precious possession. During dinner with my family, I told my grandchildren a lesson. You could lose money, clothes, or even friends. But if you lose your word, you will lose yourselves. They listened to me in silence, their eyes shining with curiosity. I knew they were still young, but one day they would understand. Dignity is not inherited in objects, but in examples. And that was the greatest gift I could offer. In the diary, I wrote, "Today I understood that the word has more value than any writing. It can build or destroy, lift up or tear down. Whoever knows how to use it justly will never be forgotten. And whoever uses it to lie, sooner or later, falls into their own deception. I want my word to be remembered as a seed of truth, because that is the wealth that no one can steal." Before going to sleep, I took the blue dress again. I looked at him like someone looking at a book full of stories. Every time I wore it, I remembered the woman who was judged and humiliated. And every time I put it away, I felt the silent victory of dignity. The dress reminded me that even words have a color, the color of firmness. And that, in the end, what holds everything together is not the cloth, but the truth. With that certainty, I closed my eyes in peace. That night, I dreamed about my mother. She said to me, "Daughter, never forget that your word is your face before the world." I woke up emotional, with tears streaming down my face. It was as if she had handed me yet another invisible inheritance. And I understood that, even absent, she continued to guide me. Fate, after all, is woven by the hands of those who came before us. and I honored every stitch of that seam with my actions. At dawn, I realized that the day would be decisive. The time of my narrative was coming to an end. All that remained was to tie together the threads of what I had experienced, and to ensure that my story was not just remembered, but felt. The word, I realized, is the purest form of eternity, and dignity, when sustained by it, is never lost. That was the legacy I wanted to leave. In the silence of a serene morning, I sat at the window with my diary open. The pages already carried years of memories, pain and victories. As I wrote, I realized that I wasn't just telling a personal story. I was building a testimony that would span generations. Every word recorded was a bridge to the future. And this future did not need material riches, but eternal values. The true legacy does not fit in safes, but in hearts. I decided to call my grandchildren for a special conversation. They sat around me, curious, waiting for something important. I looked at each one and said, "My dears, everything I have achieved is not in this house, nor in the store. It's what I've learned throughout my life. Dignity should never be negotiated. They can take many things from you, but never let them take away your self-respect, because without it, any victory is a defeat in disguise." As I spoke, I saw the seed of understanding in their eyes. They were still young, but one day they would remember my words. And they would understand that life is measured by character, not by external brilliance. I handed each of them a small, handwritten letter. In them, I summarized what I wanted them to take with them forever. "Be firm as the root and light as the flower," I wrote. It was my way of immortalizing the message without relying on the voice. Later, I received a visit from the store's former saleswoman. She walked in with teary eyes and a sincere apology. "Today I understand the injustice I committed against you," she said, trembling. I held his hands and replied, "What matters is not the mistake, but the change." She cried with relief, and in that gesture I realized that my story had come full circle. The woman who once despised me now found shelter, and I, instead of holding a grudge, offered forgiveness. That same day, I sat in the now transformed store. The environment exuded respect and welcome, just as I had always dreamed. Customers were treated as equals, without regard to clothing or status. Employees worked with pride and serenity. The store was not just a business, but a living symbol of change. And I knew that even after I was gone, that essence would remain. Because true values become tradition. That night, I took the blue dress off the hanger for the last time. I touched the fabric, as if touching my own soul. He had witnessed my transformation, from humiliation to respect, from silence to legacy. It wasn't just a piece of clothing, but a mirror of my journey. I placed it in front of me and whispered, "Now you belong to history." And I folded it with the care of someone who guards a treasure. In the diary, I wrote the last lines of this stage. Today I close a cycle. I didn't just buy a store. I bought my right to exist with dignity. My victory is not in what I have, but in what I have become. And if my story can inspire someone, then every pain was worth it. May my legacy not be remembered in buildings or shop windows, but in awakened consciences. Because the greatest wealth in the world is to live without having to prove anything to anyone. I closed the diary with steady hands and a light heart. I looked out the window and saw the sky tinted by the sunset. It was as if life was telling me, mission accomplished. There was no more room for hurt, only for gratitude. The future did not belong to me, but I was prepared to receive my message. And in that moment, I felt I could rest in peace with my own story. Because everything I needed to leave behind was already left behind. Thus ended my journey, not as a tale of riches, but as proof of dignity. The woman who was once despised in the shop window has become a silent example of respect. And the blue dress, kept in silence, became a symbol of courage. Maybe one day someone will find it and wonder who I was. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they will understand what it means to resist. And in that understanding, my life will live on. For true legacy never dies.